Welcome back, Pastor Stephen here, and we're excited to continue our One series. Last week we talked about what it looked like to live sent, where we live, learn, work, and play. But this week we're sitting down with our Director of Communications, Kari Wilson, and we're trying to talk about what we do whenever we get there, how it is that we engage in spiritual conversations, maybe even gospel conversations. So I wonder, Kari, I've heard of gospel fluency. Can you just tell us briefly what that is and maybe how we can begin to grow in it?
Yeah, I think first we have to think about what is fluency. And I don't know about you, but when I think about fluency, I think about foreign languages and mostly how bad I was at learning foreign languages. I have 4 years of Spanish and not a lot to show for it. But if today you were to put me in a Spanish-speaking country and I was to try to operate and communicate, honestly, it would be very difficult and kind of awkward. You, as my Spanish-speaking friend, I don't know if you speak Spanish or not, but we're just going to go with it. Sí, great. You would communicate something to me. In my head, I have to translate that into English. Then I have to formulate a response, which I then translate into Spanish, and then I speak to you. Sounds difficult, right?
Yes.
Okay. And in doing that, I'm still probably going to come out sounding like a caveman because my Spanish is like elementary, maybe even toddler level present tense. All that to say, it's not going to be a fruitful conversation. And I think a lot of times this is how we view entering into our spiritual conversations. It feels like this unknown ground that we don't know how to communicate. You know, we can see the realities of the world and its brokenness in our friends' lives, but we take that and we're not sure what to do with that. Okay, how do I connect the gospel here? And how do I say this in a way that sounds cool and not weird and isn't going to make them never talk to me again? Sure. And the reality of that is we often communicate in ways that come out forced or unnatural, or worse than that, we decide not even to enter into the conversation. And so when we talk about gospel fluency, we're talking about growing and communicating the language of the gospel and the truths of the kingdom. Jeff Vanderstelt wrote this amazing book called Gospel Fluency. It's a great resource. You should totally check it out. But in that, he's not just talking about the death, resurrection, burial, not that order, First he died, then he was buried, then he rose. We got to make sure we're communicating that clearly. But we're also talking about communicating the gospel truths of the kingdom. And that's what Jesus came and communicated in his time when he walked with us here. Yeah. And that's the good news that we're redeemed, that we can be saved, that we can have abundant life. We can be made new. That is good news that all people need to hear. So when we think about gospel fluency, when we're so saturated with the gospel that it invades every part of who we are and how we communicate and how we act, we begin to communicate those values of the kingdom in our lives and our words, and not in a forced way, in a way that begins to feel natural. It just flows out of who we are. Yeah. I think about John 15. Jesus tells us that if we abide in him, that he's going to abide in us, and we're going to bear much fruit. And it's through abiding in his word and abiding in prayer and abiding in Christian community that our life begins to look more and more like this gospel-saturated life, and we begin to learn to communicate more and more these truths of the kingdom.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is gospel fluency isn't necessarily a level we attain. What it is more of growing the ability to connect the story of the gospel with any and every situation.
Yes, and I think it's the reality of taking the pressure off of our shoulders. We see in Acts 4, Peter and John, they're okay, we can't help but speak of what we've seen and heard. Yeah. And I don't think that's because they're just super arrogant and they don't want to listen to the people that are talking to them and they're just strong-headed. I think it's because the Spirit is moving so much in them that they can't help but speak. The Spirit is guiding them into these conversations with people. And we see in that passage how a lot of people respond well to that. And so when we have the Spirit leading and working in and through us, not only is he giving us opportunity, but he's drawing people to himself as he draws people to us. Yeah. And we just have to be obedient to step into that situation.
And oftentimes you'd mentioned that that the Lord can use our story, what he's done in our lives, as a great entryway into the story of the gospel. So I wonder, can you talk about that a little bit, how we can use even our story to share the story?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think one of the ways that we actually get to communicate the gospel more often is not through the like thing you learn in VBS or like your three circles, which is great tool,
Sure.
right? Great tool. I use it. It's actually through communicating what God has done in our own lives. When we think about people who are far from God and close to us, it could be easy to see, and Donovan spoke to this a few weeks ago,
Yeah.
is them as so different and alien from ourselves. But honestly, we have a lot in common. We live in a broken world. We've experienced the brokenness of this world, the pain, the loss, failure, disappointment, betrayal, you name it. We've experienced those things. And so have those people who are far from God and close to us. So when we can pick up on those things and relate to people through those things, it gives us doors to share gospel truths. We have already benefited from Christ speaking into our brokenness and transforming our lives. And they need to hear that good news, that the same can happen for them.
Yeah. I'm reminded of 2 Corinthians just at that point, how Paul writes about how the God of all comfort has comforted us so that we can comfort others in their affliction. And oftentimes we are more sensitive to the brokenness of the world, the brokenness that we ourselves have experienced. So I wonder, what are some scenarios, what are some instances, some examples of brokenness in and around people we love, people we listen to, people we live by, that we may be able to hear and tie into and be able to share the gospel in that place? What are some examples you found?
Yeah, I think one of the ones that a lot of people can relate to is actually anxiety. We live in a time when people are experiencing anxiety in so many different levels and different forms. We see it happening younger and younger. And so as someone in my life, as I've made a relationship with them, they're sharing how anxious and worried they've been. I'm like, I'm worried about my kid, or I'm worried about my job, or I'm just not sure how ends are going to get met. And I can speak into that. Well, and before I do that, obviously, I'm not going to just like automatically pounce in and share the gospel. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to show care. I'm going to say back to them what they're feeling. Man, that's really hard. I can't imagine what it feels like to be worried about that all the time and the weight that must put on your shoulders. I've felt that way at times too. There was a time in my life when I felt like everything relied on me, that I had to make the right decision or say the right thing. And a lot of times I ended up being disappointed or let down because I just couldn't hold up to it. But the good news is that I've felt some relief from that. Do you mind if I share with you how I found some relief from my anxiety? And if they say yes, that provides me an opportunity to say to them, someone introduced me to Jesus, and I recognized that when he died on the cross for me, that he was telling me that my burdens were not too big for him to bear, that my worries or my fears, that he could hold those so that I didn't have to. And in those times when I still today can start to worry or feel anxious, I can know that the Lord is with me. He's saying, be still and trust in me. You don't have to carry the weight of this alone.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think about that? And, I'm able to start a gospel conversation that doesn't feel unnatural, that actually flows out of what we're talking about and provides them an opportunity to respond.
I love that you put there conversation. A lot of times we think that sharing the gospel is a presentation, and there are spaces and places for that. But oftentimes we can see that it develops in a conversations where we're able to listen and also listen to the Spirit. I'm reminded of the Proverbs that says that the purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, but it's a person of wisdom who can draw them out. And that's the spiritual wisdom. Like, Lord, what is going on? I hear a little bit, I see a little bit of brokenness. Help me to draw out what's going on. And in that conversation, be able to tell them about Jesus.
Well, and I don't know about you, Stephen, but I feel like the majority of the time when I've had the opportunity to share the gospel or a part of the gospel through my story, God has made it really clear that it's the time to speak. It hasn't been this forced situation. I've been able to sense the Spirit saying, okay, here's the door. And I just have to choose to walk through it.
Yeah. Well, we hope you all are encouraged today just by that the presence of God is with you by His Spirit. You're not just supposed to check off evangelism boxes and report back on how you're doing. The Lord is not only sending you, He is going with you. And we hope you're encouraged that He can use your story to share the story. So as we all continue on our one journey together, all continue to grow in gospel fluency, we hope we see you next time.